Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Bennett. I'm with the Project Engineering Management Center of Excellence with ExxonMobil Global Projects Company. So I'll quickly go through the agenda for today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about pre-assembly and modularization in general. I'll give you a quick overview. Then we're going to show you a video to give you an idea of the extent of modularization we're currently doing in some of our projects. Then I'm going to give you a brief overview on what an in situ construction site looks like from a greenfield and brownfield perspective. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the purpose-built fabrication yard and what the contrast is to the construction site. And then to the heart of the story, we'll talk a little bit about the potential safety benefits from this approach to construction. Now I'm going to give you an overview of what modularization is. You've all probably been around town and seen modular homes being built, where they take pieces of the homes, they erect them elsewhere, they bring them to site and join them together like Lego pieces on the site. Well, in modular construction in the oil and gas industry, we kind of do the same thing, we do it a bit on a different scale. It ranges from everything from taking pre-assembled and prefabricated structural steel components and putting them together at site, pre-assembled piping spools, that sort of thing, and it ranges all the way up to entire units that are built off-site and brought in logistically and set on their foundations. So these are kind of the ranges of the things that we deal with. Now, modularization was traditionally used in offshore fabrication and construction for a lot of reasons. One is very difficult to get a construction workforce and construction equipment to a spot in the middle of the ocean. So this is where this technique was developed. They would basically take offshore platforms and structures, fabricate them in fabrication yards around the world, bring them to site, and put them together at their final location. So these days we're starting to look more and more favorably on this in onshore construction as well. So as I said, the strategy is becoming more popular for on-site construction as well, because there's a lot of benefits that come from modularization, not the least of which is the potential to reduce safety risk. Now we're going to show you a quick video to give you an idea of how extensive our modularization can be in this industry. We talked about modular homes, we talked about pre-assembled structural steel components and that sort of thing. What you're going to see here is on a totally different level, and it's the video covers the delivery of some modules that were erected at a fabrication yard offsite to the site. And I'll let you have a look at this, and as you're looking at it, try to take a look at the vast capacity of this.
Thank you very much for coming out today. Thank you for the interest in our project. So what we're going to look at is two modules. These are called our utilities modules. So we get out and walk around them and take a good look at them.
These modules are big milestones for our project. There are two utilities modules, and we need utilities to start up this plant.
So we're about halfway through our module delivery. So we'll get another 15 of these type of moves.
Wow, this is amazing.
So altogether, these two modules weigh about 5,000 tons. The one that's right behind me is about 180 feet long and about 140 feet wide. It's about 130 foot tall. They both came over on the same ship, and it took about 60 days for them to get from the fab yard to our docks right here in Portland, Texas.
So that ship brought both of these in?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, they're big ships.
Yes, they
Yeah.
are.
So after that 60-day journey, when it arrives here at our dock in Portland, Texas, we begin to cut the steel, and then we move the SPMTs, those red wheeled carriers that you see underneath the modules now. We call it self-propelled modular transporters, move at 1.5 miles an hour. So it takes us about an hour to move them from the ship up here to the highway. It doesn't take us 30 minutes to get across the highway, and then another hour to get to the site. One of the modules treats the water going into the boilers, and the other deaerates it specifically and then pumps the water to the boilers over by the furnaces, and that's where we make our steam. A lot of work went into these two modules. What we did in engineering is we designed 3D models. So we designed these modules, if you will, on a computer, and we have a 3D model. The points that we've modeled are carried all the way through the fab yard and then to here at site to make sure that all those interfaces that are so critical fit up just perfectly.
That's great.
It's quite a facility over there already, and it's not half here.
Exactly. It's starting to come together, it really is.
Being part of this venture has been incredible. Having these modules come from all over the world, having all of the effort that's gone into designing and procuring and building these modules, and then installing them here in Gregory, Texas.
Pretty exciting.
Okay, that was a pretty exciting video, huh? It's amazing to see what technology has allowed us to do over the years. Probably 20 years ago, the thought of putting a module like that together off-site and logistically getting it to site would have been remote. But here we are. So let's talk about the construction sites that we typically work with. So you can see from the photos on this slide that we have a site here that's kind of messy. And that's typically where we start off. In a greenfield site, we might be in the middle of nowhere. We might be in a location that has to be cleared and prepped for construction. There might be no infrastructure. There might be no support in the form of utilities. So we have to put all that in before we can even start construction. Then, at that point, we would start to bring workers, material, and equipment to the site. And typically, for something like this, the workers may not be familiar with the area, the work processes that we use, and the equipment itself. So that's a bit of a challenge. In addition to that, the facilities that we typically use to support construction would have to be erected temporarily, and they're usually makeshift, not ideal. So that's one of the other challenges that we deal with. Another challenge that's very typical for a site like this is the fact that the conditions are quite raw. And as you can see from one of the photos on the site, you have workers that are basically working in the dirt and mud. It's not easy to walk around. It's not easy to do what you need to do and do your job when you have conditions like that. In addition to that, in some locations you have climate challenges where you have extreme cold and maybe extreme heat in some cases. You have some weather conditions that are adverse. Some locations are subject to monsoonal conditions and heavy storms. So these are some of the challenges that we deal with in a greenfield and brownfield construction site. Here's some other examples of greenfield and brownfield construction sites. As I mentioned before, the labor force typically has to be mobilized to the site, and they wouldn't be familiar with the site or equipment. The site's local climate conditions we touched on. You can see in one of the photos here that the folks are actually working in the snow, which happens from time to time. You can think of some other adverse conditions you might run into that you wouldn't want to be working in your yard during, let alone a construction site. So these are things that we get challenged with on these construction sites. There's also often complicated interactions. A lot of our construction sites are done brownfield, which means that we're erecting these facilities in and amongst operating plants, which offer additional challenges. Some of these challenges are like live equipment that we're working around, live electrical services and utilities that we have to be careful of, and constant work stoppages due to interactions with the traffic from the site and also operations on a day-to-day basis. So on this slide you'll see a photo of another example of a purpose-built fabrication yard. And if you look closely at the photo, you'll start to see that there's a lot of lifting equipment there that is not temporary. There's permanent lifting equipment, which is a big deal for us because in an in situ construction site, we have to bring in lifting equipment like large cranes. We have to assemble them, we have to use them, disassemble them, and demobilize them from site, which takes a lot of time and really takes away from working. So the purpose-built fabrication yard already has this equipment mobilized and in place, which is a big help. The other big benefit is the workforce. The workforce, the core of them, are usually permanent to that facility, and they're there. They understand the work processes, they understand the equipment that's there, they work with each other on a regular basis, so they're very familiar with the working situation. And this helps a lot. This adds really to our productivity, which is our big benefit from the purpose-built fabrication yard. It allows us to spend more hours at the actual work face rather than mobilizing, demobilizing equipment and getting familiar with the job site. Now that you have a basic understanding of the difference between an in situ construction site and a purpose-built fabrication yard, let's talk about some of the safety benefits, some of which we've already covered. One of the biggest issues with construction is working at height. Most of our major injuries that occur in construction every year happen from people falling from height and dropped objects from height hitting people, this sort of thing. So there's a big benefit to removing as many hours at site as we can. And when we go to the purpose-built fabrication yard, we're eliminating a lot of hours in terms of scaffold erection. So in the purpose-built fabrication yard, there's easier access to the equipment and the facilities that you're building without having to erect so much temporary scaffolding. If you remember the photos that we saw for the off-site construction, there was a lot of temporary scaffolding, and that requires a lot of hours at height to erect. So eliminating that is a big benefit. Another big benefit is elimination of slips, trips, and falls. So one of the other big benefits that we talked about with the purpose-built fabrication yard was the fact that it was generally paved and well organized. This tends to allow people to work more freely without having the hazards that you would see in an off-site construction site that had muddy conditions and maybe not organized very well. Another issue that we deal with in off-site construction is short service workers. That is, the workers that come to site, they're really there for a short period of time. It takes probably a month or so to get used to working there. They work for a few months and then they demobilize. And if you recall, when we talked about the purpose-built fabrication yard, one of the benefits was that their core workforce was permanent. So they didn't have that period of time that they had to come up to speed and then they were demobilizing. And that really helps us to eliminate the risk of safety. Continuing on with some additional benefits from modularization, simultaneous operations and working within a live plant. So when we're building our facilities off-site in a purpose-built fabrication yard, we don't have any live facilities that we're working around. So it seriously limits the number of risks that we have associated with things like live utilities, potential exposure to hydrocarbons, and that sort of thing. But the biggest benefit I think that we get out of all this is productivity. Anytime that you can spend less hours to do the same job, you're exposing your workers to less hazards. So that is one of the big drivers for us to go to modularization. There's a greater percentage of the work hours spent at the workface when we're in the purpose-built fabrication yard than when we're off-site. So this is a huge benefit. So on behalf of ExxonMobil, I'd like to thank you for joining this keynote topic. I hope that you found it interesting and that you learned something from it. We welcome you to ask questions during the upcoming live panel session. Thank you very much.